By the spring of 1565, the balance of power in the Mediterranean was about to be tested like never before. On one side stood the Ottoman Empire, led by the aging but still powerful Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of an empire that reached across 3 continents. On the other, a small island fortress, Malta, held by the Knights Hospitaller, a brave brotherhood of warriors who had spent decades attacking Ottoman trade and pride. Suleiman's patience had finally run out. He would send his most trusted commanders, Mustafa Pasha, Admiral Piali Pasha, and the famous pirate Dragut, to crush the Knights once and for all. What followed would become one of the most desperate and heroic sieges in history, a fight that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean itself. Suleiman the Magnificent, at 71, was a living legend. His name alone made kings nervous and generals sweat. He had built an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the shores of North Africa to the mountains of Persia. But he was also tired, bone-tired, tired of these annoying Knights of St. John, these Christian pirates constantly raiding his important shipping routes, stealing his gold, and making him look weak. For years, Malta had been their perfect base, a dagger aimed straight at the throat of the Mediterranean. It sat right in the middle of the most important sea routes, controlling everything that passed through. It was a key choke point, a home base for their raiding operations that had become a constant, maddening thorn in the Sultan's side. The island was perfectly positioned. Take Malta, and the road to Sicily would be wide open. Take Sicily, and the heart of Christian Europe, already broken into fighting kingdoms, would fall apart like a cheap, forgotten rug. The Knights themselves had a history of standing up to him. Kicked out from their previous stronghold on Rhodes in late 1522, leaving in early 1523 by Suleiman himself, they had been given Malta by Emperor Charles V on one important condition. They had to guard the sea routes to be the shield against Ottoman growth. And they took that job seriously, maybe too seriously. For Suleiman, wiping them off the map wasn't just a smart military move. It was deeply personal. Every Christian warship they captured, every Muslim pilgrim ship they attacked, every Ottoman sailor they took prisoner was an insult to the Sultan's huge reputation, a direct challenge to his God-given right to rule. This wasn't just about land or power. It was about honor. It was about respect. It was about showing the world that nobody, absolutely nobody, could embarrass the Ottoman Empire and live to tell about it. So he put together a force of truly biblical size, the largest sea invasion seen since ancient times. We're talking 130 sleek war galleys, the fastest fighting ships on the Mediterranean. Another 180 transport ships loaded with men and supplies. Around 25,000 to 30,000 trained soldiers, the best fighters the empire could offer. And that's not counting the thousands of support staff, the camp followers, the engineers who built the siege weapons, the artillery experts who aimed the massive cannons, and one very angry, very smart pirate admiral named Dragut, whose frightening reputation went before him wherever he sailed. Dragut himself was a legend in his own right. At 80 years old, this man had terrorized Christian shipping for decades. He was called the Drawn Sword of Islam by Christians who feared him. He had escaped from slavery, risen to become one of the most successful naval commanders in history, and had never lost a major battle. His presence alone was enough to make Christian sailors abandon their ships and run. Now he was coming to Malta, bringing with him decades of battle experience and a burning desire to see the Knights destroyed. This was the might of the Ottoman Empire, unleashed with full fury. Against this crushing tide, Grand Master Jean de Valette, a tough warrior in his late 60s, scraped together what he could. And honestly, it wasn't much. His core fighting force consisted of 500 knights, the trained fighting men of the order. These weren't just any soldiers. Each knight had spent years learning how to fight. They were experts with swords, experts with guns, experts at defending fortresses. They were also deeply religious, men who believed God was on their side. That belief would matter more than anyone knew. Then there were around 4,500 European paid soldiers, mostly Spanish and Italian. These were professional fighters, men who made their living going from war to war. They were good, experienced, and tough. But they were also fighting for money, not faith. Would they stand and fight when things got really bad? Nobody knew for sure. Finally, there were about 3,000 Maltese militia. These were local people, farmers and townspeople, shopkeepers and fishermen. Most had little to no military training. They'd never been in a real battle. Many had never even held a sword before. But they had one huge advantage. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their island. They had everything to lose. De Valette looked at his supplies, and his heart sank. They had enough gunpowder for maybe 6 weeks, if they were very careful with every shot. Food supplies were limited. Water would become a problem in the summer heat. Medical supplies were basic. The odds were roughly 10 to 1 against them. And let's be honest, the Ottomans definitely had the better food, better equipment, and far more of everything. It looked like a sure defeat, didn't it? Any smart person would have looked at these numbers and surrendered immediately. But de Valette wasn't just any leader. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life fighting Muslims. He had been captured and made a slave by Ottoman forces years ago, chained to one or in one of their galleys, rowing until his hands bled. He had escaped, he had survived, and he had sworn never to bow to them again. His hatred for the Ottomans burned like a fire in his chest. Surrender? Never. Not while he still drew breath. May 18th, 1565. The date was burned into Maltese history forever. Ottoman scouts, their small boats moving silently through the dark water, paddled into Marsaxlokk Bay on the southeast corner of Malta. The morning sun rose behind them, revealing a sight that made the Maltese defenders' blood run cold. Ships, hundreds of ships. The horizon was covered with Ottoman sails, so many that you couldn't see where they ended. The sea itself seemed to have turned into a forest of masts and sails. On the beaches, Ottoman soldiers began pouring off the ships like ants. Thousands of them, tens of thousands. They set up camps that stretched for miles. Smoke from their cooking fires filled the air. The sound of drums and war cries echoed across the island. Mustafa Pasha, the Ottoman land commander, was hugely confident. He stood on the beach, looked at Malta's defenses, and smiled. He fully expected the knights to beg for peace within days, perhaps even hours. He thought this would be easy, a quick victory, a simple matter of showing up with overwhelming force and watching the defenders run away in fear. He imagined being back in Constantinople within a month, celebrated as the man who finally crushed the knights. Instead, what he found were star-shaped forts, newly built and reinforced, bristling with artillery cannons, and manned by an enemy who seemed completely unwilling to give up. The defenders weren't running. They weren't begging. They were standing on their walls, weapons ready, clearly prepared to fight to the death. This was not the welcome he had expected. Not at all. To keep his ambitious schedule, Mustafa knew he had to secure the deep water harbor inside Grand Harbor. That natural harbor was one of the best in the Mediterranean, deep enough for the biggest ships. But to use it safely, his fleet needed control of both sides. That meant taking Fort St. Elmo, a small, almost unimportant fort sitting on the tip of the Sybaris Peninsula. It looked tiny from a distance. It looked weak. How hard could it be? Grandmaster de Valette, standing on the walls of the main fortress at Burgu, looked across the water at Fort St. Elmo with sad, knowing eyes. He understood something that Mustafa didn't. St. Elmo was expendable. The men inside were brave, certainly, but the fort itself wasn't essential to Malta's defense. It was too small, too exposed, too far from the main defenses. But every single hour the Ottomans spent attacking St. Elmo was precious time bought for the rest of the island. Every day they wasted on that little fort was another day to strengthen the main defenses of Burgu and Singlia. Every Ottoman soldier who died attacking St. Elmo was one less soldier to attack the important positions later. It was a brutal calculation, a terrible choice, but a necessary one. The men in St. Elmo were being sacrificed, and de Valette, the tough old warrior, made that decision with a heavy heart but steady hands. The fort held about 100 knights and 1,000 soldiers. They knew they were doomed. Messages from de Valette made it clear: hold as long as possible, make the enemy pay for every inch of ground. By time for the main defenses. Some men wanted to abandon the fort immediately, but their commander, a knight named La Valette, no relation to the Grand Master, refused. They would stand, they would fight, they would die if necessary, but they would not run. For nearly 30 agonizing, brutal days, the Turks hammered the fort without mercy. They brought up their biggest cannons, massive bronze monsters that fired 80-pound stone balls. The sound of these guns firing was like thunder. The ground shook with each shot. The stone walls of St. Elmo, built thick and strong, began to crumble under the constant beating. Dust filled the air. Stone chips flew like deadly rain. The noise was so loud that men couldn't hear each other shouting. The defenders, trapped within St. Elmo's breaking walls, replied with desperate cleverness. They couldn't match the Ottomans' firepower. They didn't have enough cannons or gunpowder, so they used their brains. By night, under cover of darkness, they would launch daring raids. They built hoops of wood, wrapped them in cloths soaked in tar and oil, set them on fire, and rolled these burning wheels down the slopes toward the Ottoman siege towers. The sight was incredible. Flaming circles rolling through the darkness, crashing into wooden siege equipment, setting everything ablaze. The night would light up with a hellish red glow as Ottoman soldiers scrambled to put out the fires. They also dropped anything heavy they could find on attackers, climbing ladders. Rocks, pieces of broken walls, pots full of boiling water and oil. One defender wrote in his diary, "We throw everything at them. Yesterday, we threw a broken cannon barrel that crushed 3 men. Today, we threw chunks of a wall they destroyed yesterday. They give us the weapons to kill them." Casualties mounted on both sides like a bloody scoreboard. Ottoman soldiers fell by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Defenders died at their posts, crushed by cannonballs, shot by arrows, killed in hand-to-hand fighting. The air inside and around the fort was thick with the smell of gunpowder smoke, death, and fear. Then came a terrible blow for the Ottomans, one that nobody expected. Dragut, the legendary 80-year-old pirate king, the brilliant war leader, the fearsome warrior who had never been beaten, was checking the Ottoman positions on June 18th. He wanted to see how close they were to breaking through. He was standing on a hill, looking at the fort through a brass telescope, when an unlucky shot from St. Elmo's defenders sent a stone chip flying through the air. That tiny piece of rock hit Dragut in the head. The old pirate fell. His men rushed to him, but the damage was done. For several days, he lay dying in his tent, in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he kept asking if the fort had fallen yet. He wanted to see victory before he died. On June 23rd, his wish came true. Fort St. Elmo finally collapsed. But Dragut never knew. He had died hours earlier. His death was a crushing, emotional blow to the Ottoman forces. Dragut wasn't just a commander. He was a symbol. He was the man who never lost. Soldiers believed he was protected by God, that he couldn't be killed. Now he was gone, killed by a lucky shot from a fort that should have fallen in days. The mood in the Ottoman camp turned dark. Yet despite losing Dragut, the Ottomans had finally won. They planted their flags on St. Elmo's broken walls. They controlled the fort. But what a cost! About 2,000 to 4,000 of their best soldiers lay dead around that tiny piece of rock. The fort was no wider than 4 football fields. They had paid in blood for every square foot of it, and it had taken not days, but nearly a month. Mustafa Pasha walked through the ruins and felt sick. This was supposed to be easy. This was supposed to be quick. If one small fort cost him this many men, what would the main defenses cost? His anger boiled over. In his rage and frustration, he made a terrible decision. He ordered the bodies of the dead knights to be cut up. Their heads were cut off. Then, in an act of shocking cruelty, he had their headless bodies tied to wooden planks and floated across Grand Harbor toward Burgu. It was a message. This is what happens to those who resist us. Surrender now, or die like these men. De Valette stood on the walls of Burgu and watched those bodies floating across the water. His face turned to stone. His eyes burned with cold fury. Without saying a word, he turned to his men and gave an order that shocked everyone. He ordered all Ottoman prisoners they had captured to be brought to the walls. Then he had them beheaded. Their heads were loaded into cannons, and those heads were fired back at the Ottoman positions. The siege had become personal now. It was no longer just about military strategy or political power. It was a blood feud, a test of wills between two leaders who absolutely refused to back down. Both sides now knew this fight would end only when one side was completely destroyed. July arrived, bringing with it not just the scorching Mediterranean heat, but a sense of doom that hung over Malta like a dark cloud. Inside the walls of Burgu and Sunglia, the two main fortresses, conditions were getting desperate. Food, once plentiful enough, now ran dangerously low. Each person's daily portion of bread got smaller and smaller. Water, always precious on a rocky island with few wells, now became more valuable than gold. Hope, that most precious thing that keeps soldiers fighting, started to fade like the evening light. The Ottomans, having learned painful lessons at St. Elmo, changed their tactics. They pressed their assault with renewed anger and smarter planning. They brought more cannons forward, positioning them carefully to hit the weakest parts of the walls. Day and night, the bombardment continued. Boom, boom, boom. The sound never stopped. People inside the forts couldn't sleep. The constant noise drove some men mad. Ottoman miners, skilled workers who knew how to dig, began tunneling beneath the fortress walls. This was terrifying for the defenders. They would be standing on the walls, fighting, when suddenly the ground beneath them would collapse as a mine exploded. Whole sections of wall would fall into craters. The mining war became as important as the fighting above ground. But the Maltese were just as clever and creative. They dug their own tunnels, listening for Ottoman diggers. When they heard digging sounds, they would break through and fight brutal underground battles in the darkness. Imagine fighting with swords and knives in narrow tunnels, in complete blackness, not knowing if the tunnel would collapse on you at any moment. Women, children, and old men joined the defense in whatever ways they could. Women carried stones to repair walls damaged by cannons. Children ran messages between different parts of the fortress. Old men who could barely walk stood on the walls and dropped rocks on attackers. One clever defensive trick became famous. The defenders would heat up huge pots full of olive oil until it was boiling hot. When Ottoman soldiers tried to cross the defensive ditches around the walls, defenders would pour this burning oil down on them. The oil stuck to skin and clothes, causing horrible burns. Men would catch fire and run screaming. Then the defenders would throw torches down, setting the oil in the ditches on fire. The ditches would become rivers of flame. It was horrible to watch, but it worked. Attack after attack was stopped by these fire ditches. Every single night, under a sky lit by the fires of war, both sides counted their dead. The silence between attacks was filled only by the groans of wounded men and the distant shouts of the enemy. Both sides were being ground down, worn away like rocks in a river. On August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, a holy day when Christians celebrated the Virgin Mary, Mustafa launched his biggest attack yet. He had saved this for a special day, hoping religious fears would break the defender's spirit. He hit both Burgu and Sunglia at exactly the same time, forcing the defenders to split their forces. Dozens of scaling ladders, tall wooden structures that let soldiers climb walls, were thrown up against the fortifications. Ottoman soldiers swarmed up like ants, screaming their war cries. For 3 brutal, bloody hours, the battle turned into pure chaos. Men fought hand-to-hand on the walls, on the ladders, in the breaches. Swords clashed. Men screamed. Bodies fell. De Valette, now 70 years old, a man who should have been resting in safety, was seen fighting in full armor at the worst breach in the wall. In one hand, he held a sword dripping with blood. In the other hand, he held a crucifix, a Christian cross. He fought like a man half his age, killing Ottoman soldiers who tried to break through. His presence, his absolute refusal to give up, gave strength to the exhausted defenders around him. A knight who survived later wrote, "Our Lord Grandmaster was seen that day like an angel of war. Though his hair was white and his body old, he fought like a lion. Men who were ready to run instead stood and fought because they could not abandon him." Somehow, impossibly, the Ottomans were pushed back. For 3 hours, it looked like they would break through. But de Valet's personal courage, combined with desperate fighting from every defender, held the line. The Ottomans withdrew, leaving another 3,000 dead men outside the walls. But the siege was killing the Ottomans in other ways too. Their huge army, once looking so powerful, was now suffering badly. Their tents, crowded into every valley on Malta, became breeding grounds for disease. With thousands of men living close together in the summer heat, sickness spread fast. Dysentery, a horrible stomach disease, started killing more men than the fighting. Heat stroke dropped men dead in their armor. The smell from the Ottoman camps became terrible, a mix of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and disease. Yet, the defenders were also at their breaking point. They were down to their last barrels of water. Bread was being cut into tiny pieces, with each piece split 9 ways so everyone got a taste. Men were so hungry they could barely lift their weapons. The whispers of despair grew louder. "We cannot hold much longer. We will all die here. Perhaps we should surrender while we still can." In Sicily, just 50 miles north of Malta, the Spanish viceroy, Don Garcia de Toledo, heard the terrible reports coming from the island. Every day, small boats would sneak away from Malta under cover of darkness, bringing news of the siege. Every day, the news got worse. The defenses are crumbling. The men are starving. They cannot last much longer. Don Garcia believed the island was finished, a lost cause. Many of his advisors told him the same thing. "Don't waste men trying to save Malta. It's already gone. The Ottomans have won." But something in Don Garcia wouldn't let him give up completely. Maybe it was honor. Maybe it was faith. Maybe it was just stubbornness. Against all odds, against the advice of almost everyone, he decided to try anyway. He assembled a relief force, 8,000 men loaded onto 35 galleys. It wasn't a huge army. It wasn't enough to defeat the Ottomans in a straight fight. But it was something. It was hope. Then he waited. Waited for the right wind to sail south. Waited for good weather. Waited for the perfect moment. Some said he was waiting for courage. Days passed, then weeks. In Malta, men were dying while Don Garcia waited. Then, on September 7th, something amazing happened. A small fleet, almost impossibly small when you think about what it was up against, slipped into Melilla Bay on the north side of Malta at dawn. It was Don Garcia's relief force, about 8,000 men. But those ships carried something far more powerful than their actual numbers. They carried the red and yellow flag of Spain, flying high where everyone could see it. Ottoman scouts, watching from their positions, saw those flags and instantly panicked. Their minds raced. Is this just the first wave? Is this the beginning of a massive Christian counterattack? Is all of Europe coming? The psychological impact was instant and huge. For months, the Ottoman soldiers had been told they were winning, but they'd lost thousands of men. They were sick. They were tired. They were far from home. And now, fresh enemy forces were arriving while they were at their weakest. Mustafa Pasha, already worn down and demoralized, his supplies down to barely 10 days' worth, made a desperate gamble. He ordered one last all-out attack on Burgu and Singlia. He threw everything he had left at the defenders, hoping to break through before this new Spanish force could organize and attack him from behind. But it was too late. The spirit of his army was broken. The soldiers had seen too much death. They had fought for too long in the heat and disease. They didn't believe in victory anymore. The assault started, but failed within an hour. His elite janissaries, the feared shock troops of the Ottoman Empire, the best soldiers in the world, simply refused to climb the ladders again. When their officers ordered them forward, they didn't move. Some threw down their weapons. Others just sat down. They had reached their limit. They were done. Mustafa looked at his army and realized the horrible truth. he had lost. Not because the defenders were stronger, not because his strategy was wrong, but because his men simply could not fight anymore. On September 11th, 1565, the unthinkable happened. The Ottoman army, defeated not by swords but by will, burned their tents so the enemy couldn't use them. They destroyed their remaining cannons so they couldn't be captured, and they sailed away, leaving Malta unconquered. Europe, which had been holding its breath for 4 long, agonizing months, finally let out a huge sigh of relief. The relief was felt from Madrid to Warsaw, from Rome to Paris. People celebrated in the streets. Church bells rang out in every Christian city. The impossible had happened. The cost of this victory was staggering. Ottoman losses were catastrophic. At least 10,000 dead, maybe more. Some estimates go as high as 15,000. That's nearly half their invasion force. These weren't just numbers. These were the empire's best soldiers, trained for years, now lying dead on a small island far from home. Maltese losses were equally tragic and heartbreaking. 1/3 of the island's population had died. Think about that. 1 out of every 3 people on Malta was dead. Entire families wiped out. Whole villages empty. And 250 of the 500 knights lay dead, their bodies buried in the rubble of the walls they defended. Yet, the psychological earthquake caused by this victory was far bigger than any casualty numbers. For the first time since the fall of Constantinople over 100 years earlier, the supposedly unstoppable Ottoman superpower had been stopped. And stopped not by a huge army, not by rich kingdoms, but by a rock, a few hundred zealots, and an almost superhuman refusal to give up. It shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. Before Malta, everyone believed the Ottomans couldn't be beaten. After Malta, everyone knew they could bleed. They could be defeated. The psychological shift in power was enormous and changed the politics of the entire Mediterranean region. The famous French writer Voltaire would later write with his typical wit, "Nothing is better known than the Siege of Malta." And he was absolutely right. The victory immediately captured the imagination of all Europe. Printed pamphlets telling the story of the siege flew off the printing presses in Antwerp, Venice, and Paris. They sold like crazy. Everyone wanted to read about the miracle at Malta. Poets wrote epic verses comparing the brave de Villette to the legendary Leonidas of Sparta, the Greek king who died defending his homeland. Artists painted huge dramatic scenes of the siege. The story was told and retold, getting more impressive with each telling. The knights, suddenly flushed with new fame and renewed purpose, began rebuilding Malta. They planned a completely new capital city, built with the latest military engineering. They named it Valletta, after their hero. It was designed to be impossible to capture, with thick walls, strategic positioning, and clear fields of fire. Valletta became Europe's first planned city north of the Alps, designed entirely from scratch with defense in mind. Today, over 450 years later, Valletta still stands. Its massive walls still tower over the harbor. It's a monument to the victory, a permanent symbol of what determination can achieve. Walking through Valletta streets today, you can still see cannon positions, still see the thick walls, still feel the echoes of that desperate siege. More importantly for European history, the Ottoman tide never again seriously threatened Italy or the heart of Western Europe. The empire, stung deeply by this humiliating defeat, began to change its focus. Its ambitions turned eastward toward Persia and south toward North Africa. It became stuck in endless, grinding wars trying to control Hungary. The psychological blow dealt at Malta had forced a complete strategic rethinking that changed the direction of Ottoman expansion for the next century. In Malta itself, the victory became the island's founding myth, the story that defined what it meant to be Maltese. Every parish on the island still celebrates its local heroes from the siege. Every Maltese child learns the story in school, learns about the incredible price of freedom measured in the limestone of their island and the blood of their ancestors. The siege is carved into the national identity. It's more than history. It's who they are. The knights, who had been nearly bankrupt before 1565, suddenly found donations pouring in from every corner of Christian Europe. Money came from Madrid, from Paris, from Krakow, from Rome. Everyone wanted to support these heroes. Their revitalized navy, now properly funded, would continue to attack Barbary pirates and Ottoman shipping for another 2 full centuries, right up until Napoleon finally conquered Malta in 1798. And Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent Sultan, whose grand ambitions had been so completely crushed. He died the very next year, in 1566, on a muddy battlefield in Hungary. Legend says his last words were, "Malta, Malta," muttered over and over as his life faded. Whether that story is true or not doesn't really matter. What matters is that people believed it. Even the mighty Sultan, they said, died haunted by his failure. The defeat had wounded him that deeply, marked him that permanently. So the next time you think that numbers tell the whole story, or that sheer size always wins, remember this. Remember 500 knights, 3,000 brave farmers and townspeople, and a 70-year-old commander who simply would not hand over the keys to Europe. They didn't just win a battle. They turned a tiny dot on the map into a continent's shield. They proved beyond any doubt that sometimes a powerful mix of determination, smart geography, and absolute stubborn refusal to quit can stop even the most overwhelming force that history can throw at you. They showed that courage matters, that leadership matters, that believing in something bigger than yourself matters. De Valette and his men weren't just fighting for Malta. They were fighting for their faith, their honor, their way of life. That gave them strength that the Ottomans, fighting far from home for conquest and glory, simply couldn't match. History is full of turning point battles, massive clashes featuring hundreds of thousands of men and enormous artillery. But Malta 1565 stand apart. It's that rare battle, the truly exceptional one, decided not by overwhelming numbers, but by pure willpower wrapped in armor and fueled by unshakable belief. The siege teaches us something important about human nature. It shows us that the size of the fight in the person matters more than the size of the person in the fight. It proves that ordinary people fighting for their homes and families can achieve extraordinary things. It demonstrates that good leadership can multiply force, that clever tactics can overcome superior numbers, and that moral strength can be as important as physical strength. If that doesn't make you want to dig deeper into the dusty, forgotten corners of history, then you might just need to check your pulse. Because stories like this remind us what humans are capable of when pushed to the edge. They remind us that the outcome isn't decided until the very end. They remind us that giving up is a choice, and sometimes refusing to make that choice changes everything. And while you're thinking about all that, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel, because the next time the door to your future looks ready to slam shut, you'll need to remember that even the thinnest wedge can keep it open. Sometimes all it takes is refusing to move, refusing to bend, refusing to accept that defeat is inevitable. The Knights of Malta knew that, and that's why, 460 years later, we're still talking about them.